Okay, the second part in this discussion on deviance is going to dig up our old friend sociological theory. And what we're going to do is we're going to try on what would each theory have to say about deviance, right? Again, theories are edge pieces to help us make sense of information. They shape how we interpret data. So we're going to see what each theory would have to say about deviance, and you're going to see some really interesting differences, right? So let's start with structural functionalism. Right, as we talked about in class and as it mentioned in your book, structural functionalism is the idea that society works just like the human body, right? Just how the human body has all these different systems that work together to maintain the human body. Society, remember, you can think of it as like a social body, but instead of systems, we have all these institutions that work together to maintain the social body, that work together to maintain social structure. Remember, and just like each system has its specific job, each social institution has its specific function. So hopefully that's ringing bell for structural functionalism. So what would they have to say about deviance? It's actually kind of surprising. When I initially thought about structural functionalism and deviance, I thought, oh, well, they would say deviance is dysfunctional, right? That it disrupts social order. But it's actually a little more complicated and a little more interesting than that. Deviance can serve to either reinforce social order and stability, or deviant acts can actually challenge social order and stability, right? So let's talk about how deviant acts can actually serve to reinforce social structure, reinforce social stability. And that's where this graph comes in, right? The idea is that occasionally when someone or some group of people commit a deviant act, sometimes it can actually bring us closer together. So let's look at the example, a local example, kind of horrifying. Folks might have heard of this. Let's see, when was this? A few years ago, a man was arrested for telling his female partner that he had cooked her dog and fed her dog to her, right? So pretty horrific act of emotional, psychological violence, horrible, right? And I'm assuming we can all collectively agree that this was a pretty horrifying act of deviance, right? It breaks all sorts of social norms about, how to deal with conflict in a relationship, how to treat animals. Horrifying, right? So there's your act of deviance. Now, brings us to this next box. It all depends on how the public reacts to that act of deviance. In this case, the public agreed, yeah, that's horrible. That's a terrible thing to do. So our reaction actually served to reinforce our already existing social norms and social values about relationships and how you treat pets. So this act of deviance actually served to reinforce social order, reinforce social stability. But of course, sometimes acts of deviance challenge social stability, challenge social order. Think about, the civil rights movement, where you had advocates for civil rights breaking all sorts of social norms, right? Sitting in at lunch counters and marching and protesting, right? Creating acts of deviance, but enough of the public agreed with those acts of deviance to change our social values, change our social norms, contributing to social instability, right? So it's interesting, right? Structural functionalism has kind of an interesting take on deviance and how it could both reinforce and challenge social order and social stability. So let's look at our other macro theory, right? Conflict theory. Remember, this was all about this equation up here, right? That society is marked by social conflict, which is a consequence of the unequal distribution of resources, which is really based in social inequality, right? Things like class and race, gender, religion, right? So again, conflict is not all about, we're all just trying to get along. That really social order and stability comes from inequality, right? Those with resources kind of making the rest of us follow the rules. So with that said, what would they have to say about deviance? Kind of an interesting story here too. The haves, forgot an S. Basically, conflict theory argues that those with resources, they get to determine the social norms. They get to make the rules, right? And the idea is they're going to create norms that serve their interests and not necessarily the interests of others, right? So social norms and values are largely created by and for the benefit of those with the most resources in society. Thus, the actions of those without resources are more likely to be labeled as deviant and criminal, right? So again, we're getting into this distribution of resources. In this case is power, right? Who has the power to make the rules, and thus who has the power to dictate who's breaking the rules, what's considered deviant. So a good example of this is the disparity in sentencing rates of those who were found with crack versus powder cocaine. What we found, looking at this ACLU report, is that those being caught with crack cocaine were getting much higher sentences than those being caught with powder cocaine. And probably shockingly enough, powder cocaine is generally much more expensive than crack cocaine. So those people with resources usually had the ability to pay for a fancy lawyer and had the resources to make sure they had a short prison sentence, if at all, versus those caught with crack cocaine generally didn't have the resources. So, right, crack cocaine was much often defined as much more deviant than powder cocaine, which in reality they're basically the same substance. Right, so conflict theory, again, looking at the distribution of resources and who gets to determine what the rules are. Okay, so come back for part 3. We're going to look at symbolic interactionism and see what they'd have to say about deviance.